Hello friends, in this session we'll be taking a look at the tenant networking. What is tenant networking, how to create it, and what all topologies can be created with it. So tenant network is nothing but the network for your cloud for which will be connecting the virtual machines. So we'll be connecting the virtual machines to the tenant network. Tenant network is a private subnet network which is isolated per project from other projects, and it has visibility rules as well as security groups to define what kind of access will be available. Generally, in an OpenStack cloud environment, you will have a publicly defined network. For example, this network is a public network and it has these subnets with it. These are publicly routed internet IP ranges which are allocated to it. So every project creates their own router. So let's create a router, and every router has a gateway. So you need to specify a gateway if you need external internet connectivity for it. And you want to enable SNAT so that source netting can happen. Once you define a public gateway for a router, it IP is allocated to it from the floating IP pool, and that IP is here. It has gotten a IP version 4 IP as well as a IP version 6 IP, and the status is active. That means it's reachable from outside. If you take a look at the network topology, the internal subnet is connected to the public IP addresses, and this is the graph. So here we have internet and we have three routers, one, two, three. This router we just created and does not have any additional cloud connected to it or a subnet defined for it, and neither does it have any virtual machines inside it. So let's expand this network, and now we will create a new internal tenant network. To create a tenant network, it needs a name. So temp intnet. We don't want to make it shared. You need to define a subnet. Subnet choices are limited to the three private IP ranges, which is basically 192.168.1.0/24 and 172.16 or 10.0.0.0 ranges. So you can pick up any range, any particular subnet which is allowed private IP address and create it here. So we will choose a 172.16.0.0/16 range for it. So we will specify the gateway as. Now in the subnet details, you need to specify a DHCP range. DHCP range should exclude the gateway IP address. So it will be 172.16.0.2, comma, and then 172.16.254.254. This is a pretty big range, and we can create very big ranges also while defining the subnet. The DNS server name, you can only specify something which is within the subnet, but later on with command line, you can actually update your DNS servers to publicly routable DNS servers, for example, Google DNS or Cloudflare DNS. But while creating the network, you cannot specify those DNS servers here. Now this subnet is created, but it's not connected to the router. You need to connect it to the router by clicking on the router And in the interfaces, you need to add interface. It has interface to the floating IP range, which is the internet, but it does not have interface to the internal subnet. So we just created this particular subnet. We'll attach it here. Now, if you take a look at the network topology, it will change. And there is a cloud connected to your router, which is basically your internal subnet. These were already there, but we just recently created this one. And in the topology diagram also, this is your new subnet which you created, which is connected to the public shared network, external network. Now let's create a virtual machine and see how we connect it to the newly created tenant network. You need to start with the image. You can pick up an image and let's create a simple one, which is 0s for testing. Flavor, choose the minimal one so that it quickly gets created. We will select the subnet we just created and launch the instance. First, it will create a volume. So let's take a look at whether the volume got created or not. So it's in the creating phase, now in the downloading phase, and soon it will become available state. So it is in the available state now. We can switch over to the instances list and take a look at the status of the instance. It's in the block device mapping phase. You can side by side associate a floating IP to it. Now it's publicly and routable over the internet, and it can be accessed from anywhere on the internet. So now it's in the spawning phase, and soon it will be active and available to work upon. It's in the running state now, and you can take a look at the console. Even the logs are also available, console logs. You can ping an external IP to check connectivity. It is available, and similarly you can check from external. Now let's take a look at our network topology and how this virtual machine is placed in the topology. So as you can see, a new node is available on a temp subnet which we created, and it is connected via the router to the public network. In terms of graph also, we will have We have a node available on the cloud. So this is internet, this is your router, this is your internal subnet, and this is your virtual machine. So you can add as many virtual machines as available IP addresses. And this way, you're not limited directly to connect to the internet directly via router. You can have a router behind a router and level deep configurations. For example, you want to build a 3 or 4 layer deep network, it is possible to do that. Thank you. So that's all for the tenant networking.